Joining us now in studio, Annie Kidder, Executive Director of People for Education. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
You've had about a day to digest the Drummond Report. A lot of recommendations, I think 56 of them for education from primary through to high school. I want to get first your initial reaction to the report.
It's very big and very hard to digest. I think I was actually surprised. So a lot of it had been leaked, so I kind of assumed we'd really got the meat of it before it came out. So the surprises really were in the cuts to funding, the recommendations for pretty big cuts to funding in the neighborhood of about $3 billion over the course of 4 or 5 years. So I was surprised by that, by things like fees and cuts to textbooks and classroom supplies, support staff, and I guess I hadn't expected that. I thought it was just the kindergarten and those kind of recommendations.
Okay, let's go through some of the recommendations in detail. I want to start with full-day kindergarten because that was the one that was reported widely in the media, and the government has said as much as that we're not doing it. So you weren't really surprised by that recommendation?
Except there's a kind of an addendum to the recommendation that was a surprise, which is that he said, so if they're going to do it anyway, which I'm sure he knew they were going to do anyway, they should cut all the early childhood educators out of full-day kindergarten. And that's really worrying, I think, because part of the whole plan for all-day kindergarten was that it was going to bring this, everything we know about early childhood development and play-based learning, and that is what the early childhood educators bring to that. So to cut them, I'm worried it's just going to be kindergarten but longer, kindergarten for twice as long as opposed to a whole new kind of program.
Okay, on the other side of the spectrum, when kids get older, high school, Drummond is saying that we should, if a high school student wants to take more than 30 credits, they should have to pay.
That too is worrying. I mean, yeah, your kids are young, mine are old. I know when they're 17, they're not necessarily totally know what they're doing. Sometimes anyway, they are teenagers, so they may change their minds. You get to grade 12, suddenly you go, oh no, I really wish I'd taken sciences, or I need math and I didn't know, or suddenly you decide, I want to go to that college or university. This time I'm really going to try and get my marks up. And I think to penalize kids or to say only kids who can afford it can go back for another year is a really worrying thing. We want kids to go on to be successful either in work or apprenticeships or university or college. And they're not always very together when they're 17. And I think that we should be encouraging them to get the good marks, to finish with the courses they need, and to go on to a good, strong post-secondary life. And for me, it's part of the recommendations that I worry about that I don't think paid much attention to equity, to ensuring that every child had a chance for success. Because really, truly, when you start charging fees, it means some kids can do it and some kids can't.
They talked about textbooks as well and saying to less money for textbooks. And I guess that speaks to what you were just saying, that then only certain kids, it puts the onus on parents.
Well, yeah, I mean, parents always want to sort of fill in the gaps. It's really, really hard to resist. It's part of how our whole organization started, was over a concern about fundraising. So he's suggesting a 25% cut to funding for textbooks, classroom supplies, and computers. That's exactly the kind of thing that parents fundraise for. And it means that you kind of grow the gap between sort of have and have-not schools, because some schools can afford to fundraise sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars for those kinds of things, and other schools are in neighborhoods where they can't fundraise at all. So, that is a real concern when you start taking away pretty basic classroom supplies from education, and it may lead then to more fundraising.
Okay, another big recommendation was about non-teaching staff. I think in the last decade in Ontario, it's gone up about 13,000 people by Drummond's estimates or numbers. And now he's suggesting that we cut those by about 70%.
Yes. So that's nearly 10,000 staff, he's saying, that he's suggesting should be cut. The thing we have to remember about those staff is they're not just sort of hanging around not doing anything, and they are there for the most part to support students. So we're talking about educational assistants, psychologists and social workers, secretaries, principals, child and youth workers. They're the people that are in schools that they form a team around kids. So it's not just teachers, it is guidance counselors and librarians, all those other staff in school that actually really, I mean, we've seen a big increase in graduation rates in Ontario, and I think that's one of the reasons that we have funded these staff, and we've tried to make sure, again, that every child, has a chance for success, and those staff do that.
So the argument is that schools are more about more than teachers.
Yeah, they're about a whole basket of things and education is about. I mean, education is a pretty broad thing, and you want to make sure that all those different kinds of grown-ups are there in schools in order to interact with kids.
Okay, the big one I think that a lot of parents will be talking about is capping class sizes and moving it up by about 3 students per classroom. What do you think of that? I don't even know if I have to ask you that.
Well, actually, this is where I feel like we're not going to be very popular. When we first started, we were totally in there going cap class sizes and, you know, bring them down, bring them down, bring them down. But actually, over the years, we've kind of evolved as an organization, and now we look at research really, really a lot. And here's where I agree with Drummond, that the research, the evidence isn't really there to say that, you know, a difference of 2 or 3 students in a class is really going to affect students' chances for success. Now, on the other hand, he suggests increasing class sizes and getting rid of those teachers. It's about just under 6,000 teachers, I think. On the other hand, I'd say, great, maybe a little bit of movement on class sizes, and then we can make sure we've got music teachers, librarians, phys ed teachers, which we have lost out of our schools. So the class size one, I think, actually...
I'm surprised by your reaction to that.
I know, and it's what people are going to get
Anyway,
mad
you're
at
allowed
us.
to change your mind.
I think so.
Okay. I guess the overall thing is the capping of the education spending to 1%.
Yeah. Because, I mean, I know it sounds like, you know, we can't have things keeping on growing and growing, but 1% is actually under the rate of inflation. It's under the rate of, you know, things like hydro cost more than the rate of inflation. So to cap it at 1% is really a cut. There's some things that go up automatically in terms of costs. And we have to be really careful then. There's already some tightness in the budget. You know, school boards say that they spend, or they do spend, about $175 million more on special ed now than they get from the province anyway. So when you cap the growth in spending at 1%, really it's going to mean cuts. And that's a worry.
But I guess, Annie, you know, according to the report, over the past decade, per student funding on Ontario has risen by 56%. It's not really sustainable, is it?
Well, I think that we have to remember where it was when this government started. So we had seen an era of big, huge cuts to education. So a lot of funding had come out of the system. The new government came in, the Liberal government, and implemented, A, tried to correct some of those cuts, and B, some new programs, like full-day kindergarten, like the caps on class sizes, which were quite expensive. And no, it can't keep growing forever and ever. I think that's true. And I think that education obviously has to work within, you know, it has to be fiscally responsible. But we have to remember about education that it's an investment. It's not just a cost. It's not just about the bottom line.
But you know, you say we have to be fiscally responsible in education, yet you're dismissing most of the recommendations. So if Don Drummond was here, he would say to you, okay, Annie Kidder, if not, then what? What do you want to cut in education?
Well, actually, I don't think that we need to be cutting in education. I don't think that, I mean, my big thing right now is we have to look at our revenue problem, not our spending problem. And we all have to take responsibility for that because we love, you know, we've just become addicted to tax cuts, and we all talk about taxes as if they're terrible. But taxes get you educational assistance.
But Annie, I don't mean to be combative, but the reality is, last year, the Ontario government spent $23 billion on education. And Don Drummond, and you've agreed, we need to get our fiscal house in order somehow. There has to be give and take, I think, is the argument.
Well, there has to be, but I think that you have to be fiscally, like one of the things Drummond didn't address at all that I was surprised at, because it was supposed to be looking at our public services, was that there could be a lot more coordination across the services. So right now we have education works over here, health works over here, social services works over there, and sometimes they do things that they duplicate things and they don't work very well together. Now those kind of recommendations would be helpful, but I think we have to be really careful about just assuming that we've got to make cuts without saying, but maybe we have to, you know, really part of what we're paying for is $14 billion.
Give me an example where there's overlap.
There's overlap in terms of if you have a kid who's struggling because of issues at home or who needs support where there are social workers. Sometimes there's social workers in other areas. In public health has social workers. Maybe they need to be working with that kid. It's the same with psychologists. Some parts of special education actually might be able to be supported through things outside, through public health or the healthcare system. And in social services too, recreation. Municipalities and school boards don't work together very well in terms of serving kids. And those areas are areas, I think, where we could be doing more work.
The education premier has built goodwill up with people like yourselves and groups like yourselves and with teachers. Do you think that you know, they could keep spending at 1% and keep labor peace?
I hope so, because that's what's coming next. As all the teachers' federations are going into negotiations right now, I think they understand too that they're not going to be able to come out and ask for a big salary, any salary. I would say any salary increase. And I think that it's there in the public sector that right now nobody's going to be able to do that.
Okay.
That really but so what's interesting in his recommendation, there's a lot of other recommendations about increasing the retirement age and things about qualification courses and stuff like that. So that's probably where the negotiations will go. But yeah, it's going to be dicey, but I hope it's not going to be a big war.
We just have about 30 seconds left, but I want to ask you one last question. This is the education premier. Do you think that he has the wherewithal to be the education cutting premier?
I hope not. I hope that he thinks about it in a different way than just looking at cuts.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.